My name's Bob McDiarmid. I'm at Workday Inc. I've been a Drupaler for about 12 years. I do Adaptive Insights is a small startup that was purchased last year by Workday. So I used to be a small development team, small organization of about 500 employees, and we became 23,000 employees overnight with lots of decisions and things that they were expecting us to have, including documentation, which we did not. So it's been a lovely learning curve. You can look at my sites at adaptiveinsights.com, .fr, .jp, and my personal site at robertmcdermott.com. So today's presentation is in three parts. We're going to go over the 6 reasons good documentation is important. We'll talk about my personal documentation content type that I adopted at Adaptive Insights and why it really did change how we do Drupal. And then we'll open it up to a group discussion to discuss what maybe the barriers are in our organizations around using documentation. Maybe you guys have some success stories of your own, pain points of your own. And what I'd like to come out of this session with is a group of people that would be interested in perhaps building a contributed module in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 to build out a documentation content type. So for an idea of my audience here, how many of us are devs? Oh good, a good mentor. And the rest of you are site builders, content owners?
Project managers.
Sorry?
Project managers.
Oh, excellent. That's something I didn't have before I got acquired by Workday, was no project management. Okay, so the first thing that's great about documentation is it reduces time waste. We spend a lot of time, let me get to my notes. Consistency equals efficiency, right? So you spend a lot of time onboarding, and particularly if you're in a small organization, sometimes you'll bring on contractors, and if you don't have a quick reference for contractors to build and develop in the same framework that you're using, like if you have a method around features in Drupal 7 or configuration management in Drupal 8, and you want to document all that so that everybody's doing the same thing, it reduces a lot of time waste. You don't have to undo people's work or sit down and explain. If you write really good documentation, everything from spinning up a local to generating features, committing your Git workflow, all of that you can write into documentation, or you should, and it reduces a lot of that constant, how do we do this again? Or, when I was a small organization, I did a lot of onboarding of contractors for big builds that I couldn't do by myself. So documentation was really important for me, so I could spin somebody up, and in the span of a week of having a contractor or 2 weeks of having a contractor, they could build it not only really awesome, but build it in a way that I could then take hold of once they leave. So what we sat down and decided as an organization was every time you build a ticket, we used to use Jira, now we use Asana, and every time you build a ticket, if the ticket takes more than 2 hours of work, it requires documentation, and if there isn't a link to the documentation in the ticket doesn't clear. So that may sound a little militaristic or a little type A, but it's more that we sat down as an organization and realized how much we were missing by not doing documentation, and particularly end user training. When I joined Adaptive, they'd hired an agency. We've all been in this space where an agency said, oh, we know Drupal, right? Built out the website, launched it, and it was a complete dumpster fire, and there was no documentation, and they taught all the employees at my office to treat Drupal like a system that was under a glass case that no one can touch. It's very scary. Don't go in and play with content types. None of it was documented. So when I got there was no documentation of how any of it was built. So I spent an awful lot of time waste backward engineering everything this agency had done, and in a lot of cases ripping it out and rebuilding it. It also reduces errors, and that it goes back to the exact same thing. If everybody learns to refer to the documentation and build a component or build a content type or build content on the website in the exact same method, then it reduces time for developers and project managers just sort of go in and say, that would have been great if you built it this particular way. And it helps when you fix a bug or if you add functionality, for instance, SVGs and PNGs. If you want it, CK Editor comes out of the box with JPEGs, GIFs, and a certain amount of image support. If you need more image support, you also need to talk about what's the size of that image? How do I upload that image? Do I use media? Do I use CK Editor? And all of that can be documented in one place. And it reduces a lot of flail back and forth between design and developers and end users, and your final output. You also can provide better customer service if you're spending less time repeating training, repeating how stuff should be done. If you can refer and train people to use the documentation content type in your system, you're able to free yourself up to do the stuff that excites engineers, or if a project manager or a content editor, you just want to know how to do it. You don't want to, if you have one developer in your office, he's the guy that's doing like 900 things, he's the octopus with 9 legs and in 8 slots, right? And you bother him or her and you get that look like, why are you asking me how to create a basic page again? You can totally help with documentation, and it frees everybody up to do what they were hired to do rather than spending a lot of time on churn. Oh, wrong way. Much lower training costs. I cannot tell you how much time I used to spend, particularly back to my scenario of bringing on an agency and spinning them up to work on something. If I can hand them a document like, this is how we create a local, this is how we do features, this is our Git workflow, I can have a contractor or even a new employee up and running in a couple of days versus put an hour on my calendar and let's talk about Git, next week. And you could, with good documentation, you can cut all those training costs out of the way. Documentation equals process equals performance. I think this was the biggest aha for me when I started adopting documentation as a content type. We're all about process, particularly developers, right? Dev, stage, production, all our different processes. And if we can speed that up, give it some oil and grease with some really good documentation, it increases our performance in the end. The other thing that I found with documentation, back to my story about the agency that put Drupal under a glass case, is that it created faster adaptability. And I know that's been a problem with people moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, is if you can write out documentation that's written in a friendly tone of voice, lots of screenshots, a comment section so people can have a dialogue about things that are working for them in that documentation or aren't working for them in that documentation, it increases the speed to which your end users or even technical users adopt the platform. And finally, great documentation means a happier you. I mean, seriously, all of us are doing 900 things when we should be doing 600 things, right? And really good documentation, once you agree on it as a culture in your company or your team or your development team, really changes the whole game. And a happier you means that you're going to be more excited about building a new feature or building new stuff if you know that the step that you're going to finish every big task with is writing a documentation content type. So this is a big epiphany for me, right? Everybody has that aha moment, and it's a really big deal. I didn't understand hash browns, up to our cartoon here. Didn't understand hash browns, but now I understand that documentation is the game changer. But epiphanies are useless without actions to back them up, right? So let's dig into documentation, the content type. I'll go over some simple things here in text, and then I'll break out of my PowerPoint here and we'll actually look at what I built. Simple setup. You don't have to get complicated. I know as developers you want to be, but I need this and I need to connect to that and I need to have that. Our documentation content type is a basic body field with full HTML, so you can surround things with code tags and other formatting ideas. It has link fields so that you can link to your ticketing system, whether that be Asana or Jira or whatever else. Links to Drupal docs. It's really informative, particularly to non-technical people, to be able to point them to the Drupal docs where you got what you're working on. Let's say you fix a giant bug in features or you patch a module. You don't have to write a 900-page email explaining what the patch did and what you did. You write documentation, you point to the patch, and if somebody's interested enough, then they come to your documentation content type and take a look. Quick version control information. A lot of times the problem with documentation is it gets written and then it gets stale. So what we did in our documentation content type is, as you'll see, we posted when it was originally built and when it was last updated. Then we used the rules module to ping every documentation content writer of when their documentation hasn't been updated within 30 days. And if you scan down the page and nothing needs updated, you hit the save button and it resets the update date. Because the number one thing is we always see these long sets of documentation, particularly in the Drupal world, that you get to the bottom of the page and the last comment was 5 years ago and you're like, well, that's completely irrelevant to what I'm trying to do. So one of the things that's a big winner for documentation is freshness, right? I also really like creating a dialogue using comments, particularly between devs. I have a completely distributed team. I have one guy in Orlando, one guy in Santa Barbara, a gal up in Vancouver, and myself here in San Francisco, and we're all on different time zones and different work schedule types. So having those comments in there, particularly when we do a test in stage, or we've done a release and we're writing release notes, somebody can say at the bottom like, hey, you forgot this, this, and this, and we can add it to the release notes, and as a team make sure that our documentation is as rich as possible. And as I said before, what we decided was we were going to make writing documentation part of our development process. So if any ticket that you build takes more than a half day of work or 4 hours, we usually write documentation when we finish the ticket. Meaning if it's a quick fix, you don't need to write documentation, but if it's a change to a content type, if you're adding functionality to a content type, and I'll go back to the image use, we recently added SVG support to all of our sites, and that understanding how SVGs work, how they don't work, how we're going to use them, how they could be used, all of that needed to be documented so that people don't have questions of the development team like, well, the development team added another cool feature, but we have no idea what it does or what value it adds. Documentation is another way to communicate that, not only amongst your development team, but out to your end users and project management. Do you have any questions at this point? I'm a little nervous, so I'm speaking at 900 miles an hour, so I apologize, but yes?
How do you lock this down so it's not visible to people who don't want to see it?
I use content access controls. It's a contributed module in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, and it lets you set show documentation to these types of users. So all your different user types, whether it's editor, admin, content editor, events builder, you can tell it which kinds of documentation to show, and you can even drill it down to tag level. So I'll show you when we break out of the PowerPoint into, I'll be right with you guys. When we break it down, it's tagged, because we even keep our WordPress documentation inside Drupal, because it's been such a, well, I mean, any documentation, right? Here's how documentation went down at our company. We started doing it in like Git, then we left Git, and we started building it in, oh my god, Dropbox paper, which made my head explode. Then we were acquired by Workday, which stopped using Dropbox, right? So it all had to come out of Dropbox paper, and it had to go somewhere, and that's when we had the epiphany, build a content type in the system that requires an authenticated user to log in. Our development process is when we do a push to production, we then pull the production database down to stage and development at the end of the release. So your documentation set is going to be identical in all of your environments, and set up with content access controls the same. Yes, sir?
I was just going to suggest that if you're trying to keep your level of contribute modules down, because we actually have a pretty significant problem there, I think you could actually accomplish this just using Drupal's roles and permissions. Because you can, I know we've customized their admin menu. They don't see any admin tools at all, right? So you could treat this like an admin tool and just not put it in their menu. I mean, and even if someone were to pass them a URL, and, well, I found this, whatever, you can even restrict it. I think just through roles and permissions to not allow them to access
you probably could, but the reason I use content access is because I can drill down farther. I can say if this field equals X, show this kind of user that content type. Maybe we're going a little overboard, but you're right. I think
use something similar like Workbench.
Right.
You can probably, again, if you already have Workbench, you can just use that again to set up the same type of granular permission.
Right. Sir?
Similar sort of thing, except just like, do you address like what kind of information should be left out, like API keys and stuff shouldn't be in documentation?
We do have API keys and in some cases system passwords, not like master system passwords, but like simple things like how to pull down this or yank this from somewhere in the system because it's internal. And our website is unique. We don't have any end users that are not inside the company. We're a marketing website, so we don't have any users that are in the back end that are not Workday employees.
Yeah.
So we don't have that worry of if we have authenticated users that are outside of the company, are they going to get a hold of our stuff, right? Sure. Any other questions? So the most important thing I can say about documentation and rolling it out into your team is to be gentle on yourself and make sure that it works for you, right? There is no, just as I mentioned with the Dropbox and the Git, and there's gajillion ways to do this, but we found bringing it in sight and adding it to your database really helps, and helps with that cultural adoption, because in our instance everybody loves Drupal, we're not super happy with Dropbox or Google Docs, or there are any gajillion ways of controlling documentation. And as the system administrator, I like having all my documentation front and center in the UI. Okay, let me back out of my presentation. Go. Oh, come on. You're going to do that to me in front of 800 people?
Are you connected to Wi-Fi?
I am. I don't need Wi-Fi. I just need... Sorry, I'm starting Lando on the other screen.
That's what was my point.
Yeah. If you've never used Lando Docker is also just like my favorite local environment tool ever. Totally dig it. But I should have had it spun up before I... Yes, sir?
And to add on to that, if you run it locally without Wi-Fi, like if you want to run it on an airplane, you do need to set it up in a certain way, because otherwise Docker is looking for its connection to the internet. So there's an article on it too, if anybody needs that. It's very useful. The only frustrating part about it is you sometimes forget, and then you get this screen of going, and you're like, what? And you're like, oh yeah, I'm running locally. And so it's just a different URL that you use rather than the default URL.
So what I'm going to do here is give you a quick run through of how our documentation system is set up. And as I said, it's a basic content type with a couple of link fields, mostly for pointing at Drupal docs or external JavaScript library documentation, and a number field that appends the link to our Asana system, if it will ever show you the documentation. We added it to the admin content list, so instead of searching through all the different kinds of content, there's a documentation tab. And if you have any questions about adding that to your content feature, you can ping me after. It's a relatively simple step, but if you've never done it, it can be complicated. Sorry? Oh. So this is how our documentation setup looks. It's set up with tags. It's not translated, although it's showing the language, shows the last updated date.
Can you turn down the light or something?
I can.
Yeah.
Once I turn this off, we're all going to be in the dark, but
Sorry, but
that's not unusual.
All good.
Okay.
My eyes actually prefer it.
Okay, so this is how our system is set up, and I'll show you the field structure. It's really simple. It's got a basic CK editor body field, and that allows me to add like the code wraparounds for code snippets and other things. We have a set of tags, and this is really handy, like if I have an end user that's going to build events or build basic pages or build product pages, I can filter out the content in the documentation system based on those tags. There's an Asana ticket link because we use Asana or Jira. The template used or altered. This is handy for devs, particularly devs that are not new to... Yes, ma'am?
can you max your screen?
Yes, I can. You don't want to see my Facebook? What did I do? I just killed it. That is fabulous. Thank you for allowing me to show you how I can't use a computer in front of everybody. So as I said, we created the documentation tab in here so people can come right to it. Let me walk back to it. So we created a pretty basic CK editor body field, and the tags and the Asana and the template used. And then this is the most important thing, as I was saying, well, beyond the body of the actual documentation itself, we added link fields. So if you're downloading a particular kind of JavaScript library, or in this case, I was trying to sell my organization on going to Docker, rather than talking them through it, you can say, here's the documentation, and it's just as simple as it looks. And both the Lando and Drupal 7 and the Lando documentation itself. You can also add attachments, meaning if you have a PDF or if you have other files that you'd like to have downloadable, often there'll be screencasts for for demos, like I do screencasts when I build a new content type. What I used to do before documentation is I would build a screencast walking them through it, like, hi, I'm Bob, and today we're going to create an event. And now I can just attach it to the documentation as well as a step-by-step with screenshot documentation set. So it's a relatively simple setup here. The comments, although there are no comments on here at the moment, sometimes the comments can save or break a piece of documentation. Particularly if you're in dev and you just finished a big story, say we were building a new content type, and you want to run it by other devs and get either code review or UI review from an end user, you can put all those comments here in the dev environment, have it all, go back to another rev, comment back, oh, that's a great idea, I've addressed that. It's a great way to empower your end users to feel like they have a say in the system. Yes, ma'am?
Is that attached to the content type?
Yes. So I just turned comments on for the documentation content type. So as you see, it really doesn't have to be all that complicated. And that points out another thing that I really like about having the full documentation set in each environment is in dev, I can make a lot of comments and iterations to content types or projects that I'm working on that will be invisible to the production version of the documentation. So part of what we do when we move things from environment to environment, you can use node clone for a piece of documentation and move it from environment to environment without having to completely rewrite it. So that's my basic demonstration of how we built out a documentation content type. I'm going to flip the lights back on and we can have a chat about it. And thank you. Yes, sir.
So it looks like your landing page is just like a view with exposed filters. Like, how are you building the landing page when you presumably have hundreds of pages of documentation? Like, how do you expect like someone who's onboarding to be able to navigate that much documentation of
Right.
every issue you have?
Okay, let me turn the light back off, and that's why we use tags, I'll tell you.
Okay.
Right? So let me go back to the content view. And that's a fair question. We're a smaller organization and we're just getting started, right? But this could turn into almost a website on its own, right? So you can tag over here, like I was saying, and he giggled when I said that we keep our WordPress documentation in Drupal, but we needed one place to keep all our stuff. So use case being I'm trying to onboard a new WordPress developer and he needs to know how to build a Docker WordPress. He comes to WordPress, there's his single piece of documentation. One of the things we need to add on to this that's not done is being able to filter this by content type. So if I'm an events manager, I just want to see all the how-to articles about building events. We could add a filter there to filter it just by how to build an event. But you could build any number of different kinds of filters at the top to help users narrow down. You could even create a separate tab for documentation with sub-tabs that would say how to all the things for events, all the things for products. You could get completely carried away, but this is where we're at the moment.
Do you have any search capabilities in there besides search title?
Not at the moment, we don't. Yes, sir.
What he said, I was going to ask him that search.
Right. Right now you can search by title, search by author, you can search by tag. But
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it might be a cool idea to put something like elastic or solar on top of it, pointed at this, which usually when the documentation gets done, it's
right.
Maybe starting with the permission issue.
I think we're branching into the make a module portion.
I'm sorry?
I think we're branching into the make a module portion of the discussion.
Right. So he's branching off into the discussion of rather than just building this out as a content type and passing it around as a feature in Drupal, could we build a contributed module for documentation, which I think is an awesome idea, but is this big of an idea? Yes, sir? Yes?
So I appreciate your admonishment not to get too complicated, because as a developer, that was sort of my instinct is, how could we do this? But like making a module would give, one way to approach it would be to create a custom entity type, so it's not a content type.
Right. This is a Drupal 7 stack, but in Drupal 8 you could totally...
It's very straightforward, and would then have it outside of the content node system, which helps with access. That's
Right.
Potentially could help with permissions and that sort of thing.
Yes, ma'am? Or, no, sorry, yeah.
This is some question, just to comment how excited I am because you already went through the trouble of creating all these videos, screencasts like you said, but in order to prevent people from asking for a login, we needed to be able to validate that they had come through a certain number of training.
Right.
And now, instead of having them do that, or we could still do that, but now with this, I can take those exact same videos I already have and put them in the system, so in case they forget how to do something, they want to learn something new, they can just, now they don't have to leave the UI right there, boom.
Right.
Like, where's that video again? How do I do that?
I have a press release employee that's just absolutely fantastic at writing press releases, but absolutely horrible at remembering how to particularly translate press releases. I've probably shown her 9 times. And at the 8th time was when I sat down and started this project. I'm like, okay, I need to write this out and put it somewhere where I can literally slack her back a link. Like, here's a step-by-step, here's the screenshot.
I'm very excited about this. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Very
So
excited.
the conversation will continue in the documentation channel on the Drupal Slack. They're probably going to kick us out of there and make us create a channel called documentation module or something, because the documentation channel on Drupal is more about Drupal.org documentation, but I haven't figured out the naming convention that they're going to allow me to use yet, but it is a tiny little, like a kernel of an idea, but I'm very excited to see this many people show up excited about the topic, and I'm hoping it can take off in the next few months. So look for that on the, yes sir.
Documentation development.
I'll give that a shot. I was,
You can call it documentation content type.
huh, I could do that. Okay.
There is a limit to the number of characters.
Right.
I don't know what it is, but when we created one for better exposed filters, the name of the channel is Better Exposed Filter because it was like we should just
Right,
one
so
letter
we
too
might
long.
call it doc content type or something else, but in the notes on this presentation and out on in the Drupal documentation channel, I'll put a link to wherever that ends up, but it literally started in the last week and a half. I was out on vacation. I'm a cyclist. I cycled from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., and halfway through that vacation, I got a note from DrupalCon like, oh, you have a slot. See you at DrupalCon, and well, Drupal Bad Camp. And I'm like, oh, great. So I'm here. I appreciate everybody putting up with the fact that I'm new at this, and this is the first time I've ever presented. And yeah, there you go, and you have 15 minutes of your life back.
Well, next time you do this, you have to speak at 1,000 miles an hour because
Oh.
I drink a lot of coffee.
Okay.
Is your info on the
My info is on the little speaker blurb. I'm Bob from Workday at and I'm Throw in SF on Drupal.org, THOREAU at NSF, and look for me on the documentation channel in Drupal Slack.
Can you put your contact?
I can. Let me put this back up.
I'm throwing things at you.
Bob.
Can you see that?
Yes. Can you turn up the light?
Yeah. It's Bob.McDiarmid at Workday. Sorry, I'm going to shut the lights off so she can take us a picture.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Bob, how are you connecting to Asana?
I'm sorry?
How are you connecting to Asana?
It's a simple link. It
Just
just
grabbing the link.
opens it in a new window, and yeah. I've been in touch with Asana because they have great Slack integration, and I'd love to see if we could
Now I don't even have to do that.
play with that and like yeah.
There is an Asana module, so I think you can get connected to the API. I've been thinking about getting a better connection with my site and
Yeah. Email me. Let's chat. We're new to that tool because Jira was sort of the way too much for what we do, right?
Yeah. So wait, what was that? I didn't hear.
Sorry.
I was just asking about how he connects with Asana, and he just uses a simple link. For some of my others, I have a web form so I can email to Asana to create tasks in Asana. Yeah. It'd be cool to reconnect back from tasks.
It'd be great to have more integration with Asana.
Can I ask you a favor? Could you get a picture of me from my boss with that slide?
Proving that I was here, and, you know.
Take a picture of your receipt.
Now we know this is really for Facebook.
Well, yeah, yeah. Thank you. So I look forward to continuing the conversation online afterward. It's something I'm really passionate about, and appreciate y'all putting up with my freshman presentation skills. But awesome. Thank you.